America's Constitution is the most brilliant document birthed by the Western mind. It's a study in human nature, the threat of tyranny, and responsible citizenship in a republic where the people rule themselves. But what do we do if the people lose the maturity to govern themselves? I'm Hayden Ludwig. Blessings are dangerous things. You can choke on them if not handled with wisdom. No one understood this principle better than the founding generation who stewed in biblical orthodoxy going back generations to the Protestant Reformation and beyond. As America has secularized, however, we've lost much of that wisdom, and as a result, many today fear we're choking on those blessings after all. Here to discuss threats to the Constitution and the path forward is Jeff Utsch, president of Heirs of the Republic. Well, Jeff, welcome to the Restoration Spotlight podcast.
Thank you, sir. Great to be with you.
Now, I think it's safe to say that the Constitution has been beaten, mangled, and ignored in our nation's past. I mean, that's nothing new. But the threat constitutional government faces today really does feel unique. I mean, extreme even. Only one major party is dedicated to upholding the founding principles, while the other seems dedicated to making war on them, and I'll let you guess which party is which. Jeff, from your perspective, give us the scope of things right now as you see it.
Well, I do believe you're right. One party is trying to be dedicated to constitutional principles, and the other party has thrown those away. The problem is even within the one party that says that they stand up for constitutional principles, we need a lot of educating because there are many peoples in the Republican Party and in the right in general that speak these things, but they really don't live them. And I can give you examples, or they really don't know them, Hayden. COVID was a great example. We fought a revolutionary war about no taxation without representation, okay? And that didn't mean just taxation. It really meant no executive abuse of one person mandating upon the citizens or subjects what they specifically wanted them to do without having input. And you think about what happened with the governors. I'm not picking on a president right now, but the governors. And we had Democratic governors and we had Republican governors. But how many governors, even after 2-3 months, convened emergency legislative sessions to basically get input from the state legislators on what did the people want to do. And the state legislators were all too happy to punt that football to the executive branch or the governors because they thought, hey, we're in a danger zone right now, and let's let the governors do it. But think about the precedents that has set. And think about if we had even one governor within the first couple months say, look, these emergency powers are not meant to be abused. They're meant for an emergency. Maybe I have 2, 3, 4 weeks, maybe 2 months, but we're going to call an emergency session of the legislature, and I'm going to ask all the state representatives to go out and meet with their constituency so they can get input and decide how we're going to go. And if we even had one governor do that, what an example of what it means to really be an American and understand some of our founding principles.
That was a test that we clearly failed. I completely agree.
We did fail.
It's even remarkable that so few people understand something you said a minute ago. The American Revolution didn't get started by a true tax revolt. It wasn't really the tax itself. It was the illegitimacy of who passed the tax. If I live in Virginia, Maine can't send me a tax bill.
It's a principle, right?
That's exactly right. And we seem to have lost sight of that principle today, and COVID really shined an example on that.
Yeah, COVID shines an example, and I'll go a little bit further. Liberty. Look, Pat, I'm a big proponent of Patrick Henry's "Liberty or Death" speech, and very few people study it. But there's so much that we can learn from that one speech at the second convention of the legislators in Virginia, deciding if they'd help out their brethren to the north. And of course, without that singular person showing up in Patrick Henry, we probably wouldn't have helped out Massachusetts. Because the argument of that convention was we don't have the money, we don't have the arms, we don't have the organization, we don't have the powder, and so it's not practical as much as we want to do it. But Patrick Henry stood up and said, look, hope is not a strategy. And basically what I say is the American mindset was born at that time, March 23rd, 1775, where he said, give me liberty or give me death. And that propelled liberty to our highest principle. And when you focus on that today, look what happened over COVID. We were willing to sacrifice, just about all of our liberties for just a tiny bit of safety. And of course, Benjamin Franklin and John Adams both said that if people willing to give up their liberties for a safety deserve neither. And so we've really reverted back to the colonial mindset. And I don't blame the people at large, because we haven't been taught these things about what makes an American. Joe Biden, when he was president, says, you can't define an American. And it really got me upset, Hayden, because you can. And one of the things that means to be an American is that we have liberty as our primary principle. And if you're going to err on the side of liberty. But we don't teach these things. Our founders were willing to give up everything for liberty. And very few people understand why. People preach liberty, but what does it mean? It really means without liberty, one cannot achieve one's potential. And I compare it, we're all different seeds. Some are black walnuts, some are acorn seeds, some are little mustard seeds. It doesn't matter, but we all have a potential. But if we don't have the fertile ground to be planted in, Hayden, we're not going to have a chance of reaching our potential. And it was always each generation's responsibility to keep that soil fertile for the next generation. And we certainly haven't done that right now. We're really a generation that has been selfish and that has put our safety, security, comfort, convenience, and lifestyle above what liberty means, the opportunity provides. And yes, there's some risk associated with that.
There's so much to talk about here. There are real clear parallels with the American Revolution. It's been observed by historians. I'm sure you're familiar with this. It was maybe 1/3 the population were really patriots, and these were people, Patrick Henry among them, a great Christian, a great Presbyterian, I'd like to add, who understood that I would rather die than live in chains. But there were so many men, colonists, who said, no, I'm quite all right with that arrangement. I would rather live in chains because it's comfortable. And I think unfortunately, it's a lie that we often believe that men everywhere yearn to be free. They don't yearn to be free. Too many of them yearn to be taken care of. And ironically, we may have sold our liberty for security. We didn't get much security in COVID. We haven't gotten much security with our national security state. We have $1 trillion military budget. We may be on the verge of defeat in the next major war with China. I'm going in a number of different directions here, but do you see these kinds of parallels where we have to relearn lessons that the colonists in the 1760s and 1770s learned?
Well, we absolutely do, because in effect, what I say is we went from the colonial to the American mindset.
Interesting.
So we were willing to throw off a king. We were willing to throw off an entity that told us how to use our land, when we'd go to war, who we'd trade with, how we could trade, appointed governors, when the legislatures could meet. You go all down these different things, and to say, no, I want to have a say in this. And yet over the last 30 years, we've really gone back to, okay, I'm willing to take all these things because I want to be under the umbrella of the mother country, so to speak. I want to trade, my safety. And I kind of compare it to a youngster living in a house. We were going through a maturity stage during the revolution, that the benefits of living in the house or the protections that we could have with the mother country outweighed our own liberty. And there was a distinct decision to say, you know what, it's time for us to go off on our own. And of course, even after the revolution, the mother country was like, they'll come back. They're going to come back because they can't do it. And they were joyfully hoping that we wouldn't be able to make it on our own. And that was the great experiment that Lincoln tried to save and Washington was all about, and all these different things. And you think about during the revolution, even though you're right, about 1/3 openly supported it, we gained the support of another 1/3 just by victories and standing on principles.
Exactly.
So yes, over time we gained that. And the last 1/3 either died, was wounded, went back to England, went to Canada, or decided to change sides. And when you look at the 1/3 that wasn't with the American mindset, and remember, at first they were called Tories or loyalists, but that name became too good, and our rebel fathers said, no, we're going to call them what they are, which is really enemies of liberty. And for them, you can go back and look, and those were the governors, those were the tax collectors, those were that benefited more by staying in the House than those that wanted to get out, in the majority. Of course, there were many that benefited from that relationship that also said, hey, it's not worth it anymore. So basically, we've got to rediscover what made America great. And this is something I think needs to be educated to the American people. You know, we talk about make America great again, and what does that mean? So, for instance, America as a nation was stronger with that 30% leaving because we're all, at the beginning, we were all pulling in the same direction. Remember, Washington said early on in his administration, man, we've done it. If we can do this for just one generation, we'll be the wealthiest nation on earth, because we all had the same vision, Hayden, right? We all dedicated ourselves to the same principles in the Declaration of Independence, and we all agreed upon the Constitution. And we learned so much from our founders that, look, you had the Federalists and Anti-Federalists at the founding, but the reason they were eventually willing to compromise is because they shared a common vision. They disagreed on how they'd get there, but they agreed on the vision. And today, our problem is we don't have a common vision. And so, I use the analogy, I'm in Tucson, Arizona. So if I wanted to travel back east with the wife or the family, and we all had an agreement we were going to go to Richmond, Virginia, we can compromise if we're taking the northern or southern route. But if the wife wants to go to Miami and the kids want to go to Bangor, Maine, then there's going to be fights over the wheel. And so, and it's a great lesson of when to know when to compromise, because the founders were not willing to compromise on principle of the taxes, because there was a different vision of what America was to become between the crown and the colonists. And at the beginning, there was room for compromise with our founders, because there was a common vision, although there was dangers on how to get there. And the Anti-Federalists, we learned, have a point.
Yes.
Just
Yes.
read Federalist 17, where Hamilton writes a little bit about, the federal government's never going to be the primary power. They're never going to have interest in our domestic responsibilities of the state, like agriculture and trade within the state. He goes through this list. Just read Federalist 17. It's in there.
That was true.
So he was wrong. In the end, Hamilton was wrong in the long run. So,
yes.
So when we talk about being constitutionalists, and we talk about the founding fathers and the Republican Party being on the side of the Constitution, what I have found, and I have like 14 questions I ask every candidate and talk to them about, what's the proper role of government? Why do we have the Constitution? I go around and teach the military, why do you take the oath of office? What does it mean? And then how do we support and defend the Constitution? And the problem is, most people that say they support and defend the Constitution, you've got to know it. It's like if I get baptized in the Catholic faith or a Presbyterian or a Baptist or whatever it is, and you don't know the tenets of that religion or the founding of it, what does it mean to you?
That's right. And will you defend it, incidentally? Right. Yeah. I love the comparison between Canada and the United States that you alluded to earlier. Canada is not a smaller version of the United States. They're not Americans. There's a strong distinction going all the way back to the American Revolution, because it was peopled by Tories and loyalists, monarchists, people who did not want self-government, thought republicanism, little r republicanism, was for fools. And you can see it. That was a country that had to be given its independence, that never asked for it in the 19th century by the mother country. We asked for it. We demanded it. We took it because it was our birthright. And you still see that play out today. We are suffering from authoritarianism down there. They are into totalitarianism just further north than we are. And you see the difference in these ideas playing out already.
Right. Well, their legacy and their ideals are not the same as ours, you know, and so going back to the theme, "Make America Great Again." Number one is, hey, we could start by having liberty as our primary principle again. Wouldn't that be a novel freaking idea? Okay, you know, and,
Yes,
and
that's
and when
right.
you make decisions, err on the side of liberty. I mean, that's our guiding star. It was at the beginning. And understand, when we broke off from the mother country, we weren't sending our men and women abroad and only, risking their lives. They were risking their families' lives. And they recognized how important it is. But make America get great again. Why don't we go back to the Declaration of Independence? Why don't we go through that and see, does everybody believe in this? I mean, one thing I'd recommend your listeners go to and read is Calvin Coolidge's sesquicentennial 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. He gave it July 4th, 1926. And he talks about what made America great. I mean, they're right there. And,
Yes.
the chicken or the egg, was it the ideals or what was it? And he said, look, we became great because we held on to these ideals, which are more spiritual than they are physical. But that's what's created the physical wealth that we have. So, and when we lose that, we're going to lose our greatness. So, you go through, which everybody used to know, the American Creed, the second paragraph in the Declaration of Independence, that, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. We believe that. And what's interesting, Hayden, when I talk to, and I'm sure we don't have time to get into it today, but when I teach groups, I've taught as much as 300 to 500 people in the military, law enforcement, and ask them the question, how many of you believe that Thomas Jefferson really meant all men when he said all men? Or was he just talking about the white man? And at most, I've gotten 5% of people to raise their hands. The rest
Interesting.
don't know. Yes, and I'm actually
Don't
writing a
know as
book
in
on
they
this
think he
right
was
now.
lying, or they really just don't know?
Yeah, they don't. Most don't think he meant that. Most think he meant that it was only white landed men,
Huh. Wow.
and that he didn't meant men and all mankind.
Yeah.
But here's the problem, and we have false narrative skewing this. So we have things like the 1619 Project
Yeah.
that basically teach, and that's been adopted by school districts, and it teaches that we were founded as a slaveocracy, that we fought the revolution to keep our slaves, not to wage war against slavery. And what's very interesting is, and given the time, I can actually prove that Thomas Jefferson did mean all men, and that he
Please
set the
do.
gold standard. Yeah, well, I'll take a few minutes to talk about it. So, in the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, there was a paragraph taken out because some of the Southerners thought it was too brutal against the slave trade and the ill things that the king had done. But Thomas Jefferson talks about in that paragraph that was taken out. Anybody can Google this. That the king and Parliament had not allowed any of the efforts to get rid of that, onus crime against the colonies, and that they had perpetuated this upon a people in a foreign nation. And he calls them people, slaves. And then he calls the slaves men, and he capitalizes it. And he just talked about all men being created equal. And he doesn't talk about slaves as property, he talks about them as men. And then, of course, in many of his other writings in 1770 or 72, before he wrote the Declaration, he tried to free a mulatto slave based on that all men are created equal, and this is against the laws of God and God and nature's God. Of course, he didn't win that fight. And then we see in his autobiography, and also in the notes on the state of Virginia, where he says, he fears for his nation because he knows God is just. And being just, his justice can't sleep forever. And of course, what is he talking about? He's got a wolf by the ears, and he can neither let him go out of self-preservation or hold on to him because of the moral turpitude of being involved in
Well,
this
Jeff, if I could just
heinous
interrupt
act.
you, most people don't
Yeah,
realize
sure.
Virginia was the first government in the world to ban the slave trade. That was overturned
Yeah,
by
right.
the British Parliament and the King. I may be mixing the two up there, but that's pretty incredible considering what the 1619 Project lies about, that this was all done to preserve and expand slavery. Quite the opposite.
Well, absolutely. And very few Americans know that the father of the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade is American. And look,
Yes.
I've talked to people that study this their whole lives, but your listeners can look up Anthony Benezet. He was a Quaker. And if you look at the writings of the Quakers in the 1740s, 50s, and 60s, he was among the first to and Quakers before that time, by the way, had slaves. And they
That's
were
right.
amongst the first to really realize in this enlightened period that this is wrong. And so the Enlightenment gurus of the British Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment, read a lot of what the Quakers were doing and batted it back and forth. Certainly, Wilberforce had heard of Anthony Benezet. They did a lot of reading of what he had to say, so they gave him the crown of the the father of the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade. So we have a lot to be proud of in our history, and certainly nations act like people. But like people, we go through times and eras of enlightenment that we're like, I can do better. I will be better. And at times we do. But
Yeah.
there are also times when we slip up, when we're in church or we're motivated by a movie and we make these decisions. I'm no longer going to do that, or I'm going to do better here. I'm going to treat this person better. But we need those times, but we also slip. But it's very interesting to note out of the, slavery, because it's just very important, because too many people go around not sticking up for their nation. And really what I've coined myself as, I'm really a Clarence. You've seen the movie It's a Wonderful Life.
Of course. Yeah.
Okay, so at the beginning of the movie, George Bailey is ready to commit suicide, right? and by the end of the movie, he's the happiest man in the world, and nothing materially has changed, except he could go to jail for a very long time, which is actually to his detriment.
Huh.
But Clarence has helped him with his perspective and see what a difference he's made in his own life, in the lives of his children, his wife, his community, and really the world at large, because of his brother saving all those people, him saving his brother. And so my goal is to teach the truth. And Clarence's truth was more a truth than the other truth, because his life really did mean something. And it really was important. And so when we shed light on the actual facts of America's founding, how all 13 states, colonies that became states, allowed slavery, and that within one generation they had abolished slavery. 7 of the 13 had abolished or made ways to abolish slavery. That 12 of the 13 had major reforms within their states and tried to abolish slavery, including Virginia. That the Northwest Ordinance, which Jefferson was a huge part of. There's a big argument, historically, who wrote it. Massachusetts claims one of theirs guys did, but I think Jefferson had the original draft in 1785. It was passed in 1787 before the Constitution came around, but we forbade slavery in the territories then. And it was because it was recognized as an evil. But false narratives crept in to what was being taught, especially in the South. At first, that Jefferson was wrong, and you can follow this throughout history, that first Jefferson was wrong and all men were not created equal, and the white man has more rights than the black man or the slave. But then they were losing that argument because nobody wanted to disparage Jefferson in time. And then the false narrative of, oh, he only meant all white people. And of course, this was part of the big debates between the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1850s.
Yes.
A lot of it was about this. What did he really mean? And Lincoln understood the truth. All the founders understood what was meant, and that's why we made such progress. And so to make progress today, my point is we cannot allow, because those false narratives in turn caused a civil war, because the Southern slaveholders had drummed out all debate on the question and by 1837, Calhoun was saying slavery was a positive good and something that was good for the slaveholders and the slaves. Instead of going in one direction, the vision was another direction. And this is when the fight for the wheel of the direction of the nation started. I mean, there's other things that we were fighting for the direction of the nation, but none that could have destroyed our nation, in my opinion. This is one that could destroy it. So today we need to correct false narratives. It is the largest thing that could tear us apart. And because of these false narratives and our lack of understanding of the founding, we're in the position we are today. And I'll give you an example. Look, if we would have erred on the side of liberty, would we be having these as much of a problem with our national debt as we do have? Now,
Certainly.
we're still going to have a problem.
That's right.
But maybe we could have maintained those interest rates so the younger generation would have an opportunity to live the American dream. And now it's very difficult for anybody to buy a house. And we could have kept those interest rates, and we blew it. We just blew it because we didn't err on the side of liberty. If we understood today that all men are created equal, why would we go down this DEI rabbit hole against what Martin Luther King promised? If we understood the definition of liberty, okay, and I've worked 2,000 hours on coming up with a definition of liberty, and if we understood that, I mean, we're talking about slavery. What's the definition of slavery? So we can get into liberty maybe, but look, the definition of slavery is when one man consistently eats the bread of another man's labor without his or her consent. So another person's labor without their consent. And you can say, okay, does he have to eat all the bread? Is that slavery? What about 50% of the bread? What about 40%? Right. And what are we doing to the next generation? And we're so condemning.
You start to ask questions about things like debt slavery. These unregulated buy now, pay later schemes that are tearing apart Generation Z, these people in their early 20s. And you're right. That's exactly right. And a big part of this is—
But why do they have to do that, Hayden? Why do they have to buy now, pay later? Because we put them in that position because of our own selfishness, because we haven't understood that each generation should be sacrificing for the next to preserve the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, as it says in the preamble. That's part of why we're here, not to suck it all out.
Yes, that's exactly. I was going to say that it requires responsibility. You could see— and this is a biblical principle that blessings are dangerous, right? You can choke on a blessing, it can kill you. So you have to have a maturity. In other words, you have to have wisdom to be able to handle these things. And it's clear that the people who founded this country, they possessed that kind of great wisdom to be able to not choke on these incredible blessings that God poured on this country, all of our freedoms that are enshrined in the Constitution. And we don't have that anymore. And you see people tearing themselves apart. On the debt slavery thing, I am always intensely bothered by older people who blame the young people who are culpable for taking out, these loans that they can't pay back, but without recognizing, well, whose responsibility is to teach wisdom to the next generation? If I'm a father and I'm not teaching my sons how to be good men and future fathers, it's not just their fault if they fail. They're culpable. I'm culpable. And it seems there's been a breakdown in that kind of responsibility sometime in the 20th century, if you ask me. What are your thoughts?
Well, yes. I mean, look, it's so much. We don't learn from history. We talked a lot about COVID. We haven't even had the courage to go to do an after-action report to figure out what did we do right and wrong. Because there's people still in power. We don't want to do that. What did we learn from the housing crisis from 06, 07, 08, 09? That look, when the government gets involved and says everybody deserves a house and lower standards, look, everybody wants to blame the banks and all this. Sure, they had their culpability in it, but it never would have happened if the government would have said everybody deserves a house.
That's right.
Back then, it was a lot more affordable and it was worth sacrificing for. But because they said they lowered the standards to get loans, they promoted fraud, okay? They handed out money and we had a housing crisis and a bubble and it crashed. And the same thing happened with the universities. Everybody deserves a university degree. Okay. And with that, they make money more available.
Right.
The younger generation is very prone to say, I want a house. I want a college degree. Everybody's getting it. And so what has happened with the universities? The quality of the education didn't go up. The benefactors of that move have been the universities and the administration. We see their administrative numbers go up. We haven't seen the number of students go up in that proportion, and we've seen this blow up. So yes, people need to be responsible for their own decisions and the loans that they take and the money that they borrow, but we're culpable as well. I mean, look, I was raised in Virginia. I'm old now, but in the 70s through the 80s, in my high school we had smoking sections. So you're talking 15 to 18-year-olds could go out of the cafeteria and smoke, and this is in high school.
Wow.
But you also couldn't wear a skirt. Yeah. I mean, this is in Chesterfield County, Virginia. It's a fact. I mean, I lived it. But you had to wear your dresses but beneath your knees or you'd get sent home. I mean, things have changed, right? Yeah. But it was still supposed to be illegal to smoke, but who was complicit? I mean, it was just the culture. So teenagers smoked. There was a smoking section, you could have all those things. And then when they made it illegal, you just didn't go point at the 16, 17-year-olds that were smoking. You dirty SOBs, how could you do this? Everybody was complicit, And by the way, that's also something that we can discuss about immigration. We need legal immigration, and we do need Trump getting rid of and deporting many of the people that have come in. But you can't point the finger at only them. And I equate that to the smokers. Now, I'm not saying you allow teenage smoking anymore. You still have to make it illegal, and you can't allow it to happen anymore. But when everybody's turning the other way, are you going to come down and not blame Philip Morris or the administration or Virginia schools or whatever else it is and only focus on the 15, 16-year-old? We did this, so you can't. But do we learn from this? Do we understand why there's such great debt for these kids coming out of college? So we've allowed them to borrow a ton of money. We've lessened the education that they've been given. We decreased their ability to live the American dream because you can't buy an affordable home right now because it's so expensive to build. And the same people, and look, I build houses as well, the same and develop land. And the same people in the county and the state who call for affordable land and housing make it impossible to get land so you can actually develop it. And so what happens to the cost? So they're speaking out of both sides of their mouths. They have no idea what they're doing. And so it's a very difficult situation we found ourselves in, Hayden. But it all starts with education. Because if you have an education of the founding and the Constitution, you understand property rights, you understand land rights, which is one of the reasons we separated from the mother country. Hey, we've got this land. We want to use it as we want to use it, not as the crown and parliament want us to use it. And so it all is founded from there. If any one of these governors understood the founding, and I'm convinced they did not. Look, I have taught some of our congressmen and women before they go into office about some of these things, but I do find that most don't know these things. But think about if we would have had somebody being the shining light, and we learned from the Patrick Henry story, even if we would have had one governor show the way and set the path for the others to follow. So you need to have that education, and then you need to have the courage of your convictions and be steeped in principle enough to live them. And one person can make a difference. It doesn't take, and I use Patrick Henry as the example. If he was not there, March 23rd, 1775, Massachusetts did not have the wherewithal to win. They needed Virginia.
Yes.
If George Washington wasn't there, there were only two general officers in the Revolution that were there from the beginning to the end, Nathaniel Greene and George Washington. And he was an indispensable man. Thomas Jefferson, as much as he's disparaged today, if he wouldn't have been able to take the pieces of the puzzle of the Declaration and put them together in a coherent, simple thing that became American scripture or the American Creed, which we don't know today. These things, in the Constitutional Convention, there were times when one person was able to bring both sides because they were ready to walk out.
Yes.
So are we ready to be that person? And it may not be on a national scale. It may be within our family and saving relationships. It may be within our company. It may be within our community. But we want to be able to be the Clarence and educate. My daughter-in-law once, I teach at the Leadership and Freedom Center in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. My mom was raised there, and that's what got me all into this, because as a little kid down in Richmond, Virginia, we didn't play Cowboys and Indians like many of the Westerners did. We played Rebels against the Yankees. And in Richmond, nobody wanted to be a Yankee in the early 70s. And of course, I'd visit my cousins. Yeah, times have changed. I'd visit my cousins in Gettysburg, and they'd say, it's a good thing we beat y'all rebels, you rebels back then. And I was like, that's not what I'm hearing. And I mean, this is as early as kindergarten.
Sure.
And so at a very young age, I started reading. My mom read to me first the West Point story and all these books. And then I got into reading when I was 15, finding out what caused it. What was the cause of the Civil War? Why did we have to go here? And was it avoidable? And of course, that takes you all the way back to the founding and where the seeds were planted. And we need to be able to defend these things. Look, even Frederick A. Douglass, who was a former slave and was very frustrated at the progress that America was making in 1852, his July 4th, I think he gave it on Fifth Speech. Most of the speech was lambasting America about how terrible she was. But then at the end, she's like, hey, our founding documents are pure, and we need to be guided by them. And the only reason I'm bashing you is you haven't lived up to the promises that you have made here. And of course, Martin Luther King took from that and used it in his content of character speech about the Declaration and Constitution being a promissory note that hadn't been cashed yet. And he was right. We have those guiding principles. They do not need to be corrected. We need to live more by them, but we have to know them first. And so changing perspectives is really important, because if we don't, we're more on a suicidal path a la George Bailey, rather than recognizing we are the luckiest people on the planet, and that we need to act as such, recognize it, and do everything we can every day to live up to those ideals in the Declaration, and recognize that the Constitution is what the founders ratified to protect the ideals of the Declaration, not the other way around. When I teach oath of office and the Constitution, we need to keep in mind, as Lincoln said, the relationship between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution is like an apple of gold surrounded by a frame of silver. And the latter is for the first, not the first for the latter. So the Constitution, its primary objective is to protect our vision, our why, our ideals and values. And those are all found in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. And how many of us believe, first of all, know them, believe them, and can teach them today?
So, Jeff, it stands out to me that in the period right after the American Revolution, and again after the Civil War, you had these periods of intense cultural conflict. They really were culture wars with a shooting component. And they're followed by these periods of prosperity rebuilding, but also cultural unity. And if we remember
Yes.
right, that seems to be the period we're in is the, thank God not shooting yet anyway, but we're in the culture war part of all of that. The root of culture is what we believe, cultus, right? And you see this thread going back. We cannot be on the same page if we don't have the same language, the same God. And a lot of that is transmitted through families. A lot of it's translated through the church and through education. I think those three things are inseparable here. I mean, this is a big topic, obviously, this whole idea of American reawakening, and you called it enlightenment. What do you think about the phenomenon of the rise of classical Christian homeschooling, or church schooling, I should say, in all of this? Because it seems to me people, young conservatives especially, are really waking up to, wow, we've been lied to about everything our entire lives. I know that's what's radicalized me in all of this stuff, realizing, yes, on the Civil War, on the American Revolution, everything that my public school experience taught me, it basically was all a lie. Oh, and I still can't do math, by the way, but none of those things are even true. And realizing that, wow, this country really was founded by Christians who are, despite some denominational differences and conclusions, we're really on the same page about why we're doing this and which God we worship. Do you see the same kind of rise going on right now, this kind of reawakening that happened in the period right before 1776? Or am I fooling myself here?
No, I don't think you're fooling yourself. Washington said it's a shame in our type of republic that we have to feel before we see. And we have to feel enough pain before we see this. And so enough people have felt enough to know that when we outsource the responsibilities we should be taking, a la educating our kids, our church worship, understanding our own history, what it means to be a good citizen, when we outsource that, it's very risky because we're leaving it into somebody else's hands. And we know that the left, or the enemies of liberty, have taken over. And we felt too comfortable to let our children be raised, by somebody else that has different ideas. And so we need to recognize we cannot outsource what is most precious to us, and that's our children and the next generation. And that we should and can sacrifice everything for their well-being. And of course, COVID was not a good example. Many parents say they'd stand in front of their bus for a kid, but we wouldn't even stand up for our kids to go back to school when we knew it wasn't killing them. No, think about it. As a nation, we say we'd sacrifice everything. We weren't even willing to take a 0.5% risk for them.
Yes, that's
let alone do anything. I mean, that's how selfish.
Canceled. I could lose my job. It's your child.
No, I mean, yes. So we need to do what my mom used to say to me. Hey, son, you need to get your priorities straight. And we need to take a look in the mirror and understand we need to get our priorities straight. And we need to look in the mirror and understand, and I'm sorry to say this, who are the slaveholders now? And the bottom line is we are. Because we're enslaving our children, because we are so selfish that we don't understand that we're spending them into obliteration, and that we're eating 30-40% of their production of the next generation or two, and we're sucking out. In effect, we're blood transfusing and sucking out their blood and putting us in us, and we think we're the good guys.
Well, if I can, it's like we're living like we're the last generation. Nobody will ever come after us. So I have no responsibility to anything other than there is no God. It's just this life. And so whatever I can do to make myself happy and comfortable. I don't know about you. I see this as the rotten fruit of all of the isms, secularism, feminism, all of these lies that have tried in their various forms to replace the one central truth. You're not here to serve yourself. You're here to serve the living God who made you and designed you and made you in his image. And if you can't get that right, you will not get anything of substance correct.
No. Which is full circle of where you started. Do you think it's important to go down the revolution that we're doing now and educating our children and the church coming back and offering those schools? Because it is because that we have not had the moorings of this foundation, because of course the United States never would have come to being without the moorings and the teachings of the Christian churches, because of the individual, the sanctity of the individual. and how God looks at all of us as the most precious. We are his sons and daughters. And instead of all this, I mean, a lot of issues would be solved, Hayden, by, teaching our children that you shouldn't, I mean, your primary identity isn't if you're white, black, Indian, Japanese,
Right.
whatever. Your primary identity is a child of God. And we all share that. That's our primary identity. And just think of the things that would be wiped out if we just looked at each other as a child of God. That's it. I mean, that's
Yes.
our primary identity. And when you don't teach that, and it's your sexual preference or your sex, how you identify, that's not your identity.
Well, Jeff, this is incredible, and I wish we could talk all day. It's been so enlightening talking with you. Tell me, where can people find out more about your work, your teaching, and support you?
Thank you for asking. They can reach me, Jeff at fullmeasureleadership.com is my email. I come and teach local law enforcement, military, all over the country, and am happy. But my biggest thing is really my whole mission in life is to try to reach my own potential while helping others do the same. And the only way to do that is to really be founded on these principles that our founders have discovered and implement them. And it is based on Christianity and sacrificing and for others. But it's also based on the parable of the talents, the 10 virgins, all that kind of stuff. We need to be prepared for what's ahead of us. And right now, as a nation, we're not.
Well, Jeff Utsch, thank you so much for your time. It's been really enlightening.
Thank you. Hayden, good. Thanks for all you're doing, sir. Take care.
I'm Hayden Ludwig, and this is Restoration Spotlight, a project of Restoration News, your source of headline-smashing investigative journalism for the America First movement. Check us out at restoration-news.com. And until next time, stay vigilant and trust in God.